Yo, hello, welcome to our episode 174. This is Herpetological Highlights, the podcast about the science of reptiles and amphibians. My name's Tom Major, co-hosting with me as per is Ben Marshall.
Hey.
And we're going to take a little trip back down to Salamander Avenue this evening. Well, it's evening for me, it's morning for Ben. But yeah, we're going to be talking about salamanders, which is always fun. We haven't done it for a little while. Have we not done it for a little while?
No, we were literally talking about hybrid ones like in the past few episodes. Yeah. Really,
2 weeks ago.
We're in a new salamander era, and I'm all here for it. They're great slimy little critters.
We are giving them a lot more airtime.
Finally, their time
maybe
is
they
now.
Deserve. No, they do deserve it for sure. Yeah, and we're going to be talking about a really cool species of salamander, the fire salamander, which is, I think, we were talking about iconic reptiles a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, with the crocodiles, saying, Nile crocodiles, undeniably an iconic beast of the waterways of Africa.
Yep.
I would suggest that there are few salamanders, potentially even few amphibians, that are more iconic than the fire salamander.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely one of the coolest looking ones. This mixture of bright yellow and black blotches on what is quite a chunky salamander. I think that makes them cool as well. They grow quite big, so up to 25 centimeters long. So, you can slap that thing on your forearm.
You can see their faces too.
Yeah.
They
do have an undeniable face. Very nice, cute eyes. Something about the shape of their heads makes them endearing.
Well, they have a big smile.
They do. And as we'll see, smiling in the face of what you could consider to be quite serious adversity.
Potentially for some salamanders, apocalyptic, I suppose, would be not too far from the truth, I think.
Yeah, that's deep, but it is true. So, yeah, let's talk about what do they do? So, fire salamanders, they're living on the forest floor. They're found in Europe, and they spend a lot of time underground or in crevices. They come out in spring, particularly at night. They like to hunt small creatures at night, so they'll eat, invertebrates, that kind of stuff. Most of the time during the heat of the summer, they'll spend underground. Once autumn comes around, it's time for them to mate. And these things, they have internal fertilization, so they still look like they're mating, the male on top of the female on her back, similar to like how a frog mates. But these guys will be doing it mostly on land. And the male will, after they've sort of been doing their breeding wrestle, the male will deposit a sperm packet on the floor, and then the female picks it up with her cloaca, and that's how they mate. And then the embryos will develop inside the female, and she will eventually give birth to, they're not fully formed salamanders, they're the aquatic larval phase, and she'll lay them into a slow moving stream, and they'll have external gills. They'll look like an axolotl but very small. And then they'll swim around, do their thing until they eventually metamorphose and start doing it all over again. Well, let's introduce this paper, because the title of the paper will give people an idea of what this is going to be about. So it's by Erens, Preissler, Speybroeck, Beukema, Spitzen-van Der Sluijs A, Laudelout, Kinet, Schmidt, Martel, Steinfartz and Pasmans, 2023, Divergent population responses following salamander mass mortalities and declines driven by the emerging pathogen Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans. And this was published in Proceedings at the Royal Academy B, a journal we both like because it's got nice colour scheme.
We enjoy the typesetting.
So lame. Oh my God. It's true though. I love it. So these little beauties, they've been weathering a pretty bad storm for the last 10 years ago. This disease was discovered. So in 2013, this fungal pathogen called Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans, saying it again, glutton for punishment.
You're doing very well.
B-sal for short. Thanks.
B-sal,
yeah.
I think, is what we'll operate using from here on out, though.
Yes. We'll use B-sal because it's nice and easy. Anyway, B-sal was discovered, and it was actually first discovered from this species of salamander, and it was first noticed because they were dying. And the name of this fungus gives a bit of an insight into its nature, because the species epithet, which, as I've already said, is salamandrivorans, but that means, in Greek, salamandra means salamander, and Latin vorans just means eating. So the name of this species literally means salamander eating, and it refers to the fact that when they contract this fungus, when it starts growing on them, it causes a lot of destruction to the skin, and leads to rapid death in almost all infected salamanders in Europe. It probably came because this is a fungus which originates, it's thought, in East Asia, and it's thought that pet salamanders basically traveled across the world, and then either some salamanders were released by people who didn't know better, or they were, maybe someone poured away some water and it came into contact with the wild amphibians, and sure enough, the amphibians which had no previous experience being exposed to this B-sal fungus are very susceptible to it. And in European fire salamanders, it causes death in close to 100% of individuals that it infects, and so has caused this mass mortality, massive die-off. And with that threat kind of looming, we're talking about these salamanders on a large scale in Belgium and the Netherlands, so not a million miles away from UK, but they're found in these distinct populations. So, you don't have salamanders everywhere. They're kind of in pockets separated by many miles.
They have their habitat preferences and their microhabitat sort of preferences, don't they? They do require water. And I can't imagine they're particularly compatible with European agricultural practices either.
No, you wouldn't catch one of these guys in a field.
No.
They're more woodland sort of. They much prefer woodland, whereas there's lots of nice sort of moist, damp microclimates for them to enjoy. But in this study, they had populations of fire salamanders which had been exposed to this B-sal fungus in Belgium and the Netherlands. It was a mix.
Yes, it was a mix. Yeah. 2
Yeah.
in the Netherlands, 2 in Belgium. Yeah.
And so, essentially they were kind of monitoring the effects that this fungus was having on these populations. And I mean, should we just they also were fortunate enough to have lots of uninfected populations with which they could compare.
Yep.
And props to the Flemish Citizen Science Monitoring Network, which did all the salamander surveys in the kind of non-infected areas, and they were able to create population estimates because of that. So, shouts to those volunteers, because that kind of gives the data on the healthy populations so that then we can talk about the unhealthy populations in the context of how bad it actually is.
Right, because you need something to compare, because otherwise you don't know what the impact of the sort of B-sal presence was. It could just be all salamander populations in this area are declining for whatever reason, like something else that isn't B-sal. So you need that comparison to be able to ID the B-sal impact.
Exactly, yeah. And so in this study, they had 4 places with populations of fire salamanders, all exposed to this new fungus B-sal. Of those 4 populations, and this only started back in 2013. Some of them, when the paper was written, had only been exposed for like 6-7 years. Of those populations, 3 out of 4 are still there.
They're still kicking.
Yeah, one unfortunately went extinct. They did say that population might not have been a natural population.
Yeah.
It might be a population which humans had kind of recently introduced deliberately. Maybe someone thought it'd be good to have fire salamanders in that place. And it was a small population in a place called Putzberg. But that one did go extinct after the introduction of the fungus. But the other 3 natural populations are still going. But that's not really as good as it sounds, because numbers are only around 5% on average of pre-fungus levels. So so only 1 in 20 on average, approximately, salamanders will have survived the onslaught of the fungus.
Yeah, just as a comparison, so they've got this very nice plot sort of comparing the time series of their ones that they were monitoring that had been infected versus the ones that are not. And you're talking these populations starting at like probably 80 plus salamanders per kilometre, and that's what the sort of healthy populations are looking like. And then at the end, you're talking sub 10, sort of 2, 3, 4 salamanders per kilometre. The graph underplays how dramatic the declines are, despite them looking very dramatic on the graph, because we're talking about a logarithmic, magnitude loss of salamanders, salamander density.
Yeah. At first glance, I looked at that and I was like, oh, it's not that bad. They're coming back. And I was like, oh, wait.
Oh, wait a second.
Yeah, logarithmic scale.
Yeah.
So, like, this is 1 and that's 100. I was like, oh, no. No salamanders left. Anyway, pretty savage. 3 out of 4 populations, low numbers.
But they're not gone.
They're not gone.
They're not gone.
No. And we are going to talk about some positives, because hope dies after the last salamander.
Right.
And there were some other effects of the fungus. They found that salamanders were, on average, much smaller in the affected populations. And they think... They're not sure exactly why.
I would take a slight exception to use of... There was still overlap. They were on average smaller, but there was still overlap. There were still large individuals left in the infected populations.
Yeah, there were
Just
still large
so.
individuals left, but way less.
Yeah.
Like, chronically, significantly less big ones, right? They were, like, notable.
Yes, but there's still overlap, is all I'm getting at. I don't want to give the impression that
it's not
suddenly
like,
all the big salamanders died and the entire population only exists up to like 120 millimeters or something.
Yeah, that's definitely not the case. You're right. There is still, salamanders of all sizes, but on the whole, if you were to pick out an average salamander, likelihood it would be a bit smaller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
However, they talk about that, and they suggest some possible reason for it would be that the salamanders, obviously this is a fungal disease. It's transmitted mostly, they think, by contact. And so when salamanders are adults, they're going to be mating, and they come together then and probably transmit the disease during the mating periods. Males also fight for supremacy in this species, so they do this kind of really slippery wrestling, although it sounds like they wouldn't be good, but they are actually really good at it. They are quite effective. It's kind of a mixture of coiling around the opponent, and then there's a bit of flipping over, some body slams. I watched some videos of it thinking it'd be really frustrating to watch salamanders fight. It was actually pretty cool. But yeah, this kind of likely spreads it as well. If the males are wrestling, they're going to be touching, and then, fungus is there, and then, it's not good from there. With salamanders that are young, not breeding, they're potentially less likely to encounter the fungus because of that route, and they're likely not socializing other than that, as far as we know.
The populations where it's infected, you have a tendency for the average salamander to be below 150 millimeters body size. But so in the unaffected, it tends to be over 150 millimeters body size. When you compare that to when people observe mating and sort of reproductive activity in salamanders, it tends to be with individuals over that 150 millimeter size. So I am wondering whether the sort of remnant populations are, in general, younger salamanders, or they haven't yet got the capacity, haven't yet got the capacity to reproduce because they're not quite large enough.
Yeah.
There's an additional dynamic to the sizes. It's not just it's tied into the behavior is what I'm getting at. Like you're saying with the wrestling. Is it just, are the big ones more vulnerable because they're expressing sort of that male-male combat stuff, but is it also just big ones are involved in reproductive activities that tend to drive salamanders together and therefore increased exposure? And now we've got almost like zombie populations where they're sitting there, they're younger salamanders, they haven't yet been impacted by the B-cell because they're not in contact with each other as much, and when they grow up and fall into this 150 mil upwards where these behaviours are observed, transmission will sort of kick back up again.
Yeah, it could be the case.
But that being said, there are still larger salamanders there, so it's not like that population is suggested to be completely unproductive right now.
Yeah. They also had a look at the genetic diversity of these populations, and there was a bit of good news there. They didn't detect a strong loss of genetic diversity that, as far as they could tell so far. Yeah, I don't know if people might take that further and maybe discover that if you look in a different way there is, but their sort of analysis suggests that, there is still a lot of genetic diversity in these populations, so, they could have potential to still adapt. They also kind of unfortunately didn't see any real sign that the salamanders were developing an immunity. They tested the mucus of salamanders, which were and weren't exposed, and they really didn't have much ability to counter the fungus. One thing that I thought was really cool is that while the mucus of the salamanders themselves doesn't seem to be able to battle this fungus, when it lands on them, it just eats them. But one thing they mentioned is that it's possible that there might be other microorganisms which live on the salamander or can live on the salamander. So part of their
microbiome.
What's that called? Microbiome. Thank you. Yeah. And it could be that new microorganisms come in which actually eat the fungus and kind of exploit it as a resource. And they might come along and actually solve the problem sooner than the salamanders can. I don't know how much we know about how the ones in East Asia sort of maintain an immunity or live alongside this fungus. But yeah, that is a potential source of hope. Maybe some microorganism's going to just ride in and start
some sort of weird symbiotic salamander microbe team up to counter B-cell.
That would be super cool. And honestly, if someone needs to go around and squirt the salamanders with a water pistol with a special microbe, I'll do it.
I'll do it.
Yeah, I'll do it. Sign me up.
Spray them all down.
But crucially, these populations are not extinct. They're still persisting, and so many people care about these salamanders. I mean, You know, the strength of the citizen science monitoring network speaks for itself.
Yep.
I know a lot of people have got skin in this salamander saving game. So yeah, I would say, although this paper is like kind of chronically depressing and it does draw attention to sort of sad facts about these salamanders, the hope isn't lost by any stretch.
No, and I think there's also these little hints that because it's not entirely sure why some are persisting and some aren't. There are sort of suggestions that maybe microhabitat stuff could be playing a role as well, which I think plays nicely into your microbiome stuff. There is another layer of interaction between salamander, fungus, and environment, be that a sort of very close on them bacterial or micro scale, or something a bit broader with a particularly lovely type of vegetation that does well for salamanders and doesn't do very well for B-sal. I mean, you can think of any sort of virus or disease, it does better in certain environments, right? So if these salamanders can exist in a gradient, then potentially there are some that will do better and some that will do worse because of how B-sal interacts with that.
Yep. Here's hoping that soon we'll be able to cover some papers on the recovery of these salamanders.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. They're still there, and there's enough of them, hopefully, to build back.
Yeah. Cool. Well, shall we move on to our species of the bye-week from salamanders to snakes?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this is a paper by Kane, Tapley, La, and Nguyen, 2023, a new species of the genus Rhabdophis from the Hoang Lien range, northwest Vietnam. So we're in a mountain in Hoang Lien range, northwest Vietnam here. Quite sort of high altitude area of forest. It's sort of like not brand new forest, it's sort of like secondary disturbed forest. But yeah, some scientists have described a brand new species of Rhabdophis, which are famous for being the genus which contains snakes which are poisonous and venomous. It's obviously one of those things that people love, especially if they're like quite new to the game. They just found out the difference between poisonous and venomous. They get straight on the internet there and there you go and tell everyone, you idiot, you're saying poisonous, you should be saying venomous. And then the ones with a little bit more keyboard experience come back and they say, hey, what about Rhabdophis, the one that's poisonous and venomous? And then that conversation happens.
Like, well, they're kind of cheating because they're sequestering toad toxins, and are they really producing it themselves?
Level 3! Yeah, that's what they're famous for. They're pretty badass.
They're lovely snakes, yeah.
Really cool, yeah. We were fortunate to see them in Thailand, weren't we? Really awesome. And yeah, this is a brand new species. This one, I would say, is a little bit more of an unassuming in appearance specimen.
Yes, less flashy. Some of the others, sort of Southeast Asia, have very dramatic colour schemes of red, yellow and green in various shapes and patterns. And I think the one in Japan is sort of more striking with its markings too.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, right on. But yeah, so let's talk about this species. They've called it Rhabdophis mongorum, which is, well, they called the common name Mong keelback, and they also gave it a Vietnamese name, which I'm not going to try and butcher. But the etymology, if you're wondering what mongorum means, it is a patronym for the Hmong people, who are an ethnic minority in the northwest montane regions of Vietnam, where the snake comes from. And apparently they were very helpful in finding the type specimen of this new species in this province of northwest Vietnam. And as I said, you know, it looks a bit unassuming. It's kind of this sort of solidly grey-brown in the pictures, but in the paper they describe it as a purplish grey with a distinct iridescence. So yes. I suspect that in the flesh it's actually pretty damn nice looking. And iridescence isn't really something that carries over in pictures.
It's quite hard to capture, yeah. And I think there's little hints of the purpliness in the sort of photographs of life images. It's hints that it could be purpley.
Yeah, and this snake, I mean, it looks like a diurnal snake. I'm assuming it's active in the day. I think the one they found was active in the day. They suggest it might be quite rare because people do like to smash snakes locally, unfortunately. There's also pressure from people cutting down the forest, and also it's high elevation, so you've got a little bit of a climate change risk there. But right now, it's out there, it's persisting, and they suggest it might have a broader range and also be from neighbouring China, because this area is right on the border with China. And they actually did some sequencing of an old museum specimen that was pickled in a museum up in China, and they found that it was genetically the same as the new species they were describing from Vietnam. So that kind of suggests that
That's
at
good
least
news.
up until very recently, it had a broader range and probably still does. And they also say that this region of northwest Vietnam probably harbours more species of undiscovered reptiles. So watch this space.
Yeah. About 40 centimetres SVL too, which I think is kind of classically Rhabdophis sized.
Yeah, they always about that size. The ones that we saw, was it subminiatus?
Yeah, prime frog-eating size, I would suggest.
Yeah. Very good. So yeah, welcome to science. Our brand new species, Rhabdophis mongorum. Any other business, Ben, this week?
I do have some any other business. I have a paper out and about in the wild, in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, about, basically it's about implementing code review in the sort of scientific, so we've called it the scientific workflow, but basically as you're doing science, as you're doing work, there should be points where your code is actively reviewed by constructive and friendly fellows, I guess. Yeah, it's not anything herp focused, but basically, yes, it's just suggestions and recommendations on how to consider code review and sort of advocate for its importance.
Yeah.
While also trying not to be like overbearing and scary about it, because everybody makes mistakes in codes. It's an inevitability. This isn't like we need to set up some sort of code watching squad to make sure there are no mistakes in science. That's not what it's about. It's more about encouraging people to build a better space for that, because so much of science is always tied into coding in some fashion, especially in ecology, when very few out of the box solutions actually work, because we work in messy, complicated, hard to control, especially certainly natural environment stuff. Like, it's a mess out there, and you tend to need stats and data manipulations that can account for that tend to be bespoke.
Yep. It's a complicated old world to try and study, mate.
Yeah.
And well, congrats to you and the other authors. Like I say, this came across my newsfeed somewhere, and I read it before you'd even mentioned it. And I think the tone's spot on in terms of like, look, coding is hard, but also super important. And like, it's kind of like massively gained traction as something which we all are expected to do as part of our work. And like, the reality is that sometimes you could be working on a project and you may be the only one who knows how to do that, or other people are doing things that you don't really necessarily get, and having that sort of oversight is probably going to avoid a lot of problems when people try and reanalyze data sets. Yeah,
or even just try and use code that you've created and stuff. It's a sort of interpretability issue as well, just making things readable.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, wicked. Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Also a link in the show notes, we've had a preprint come out. So this was a study led by my friend Andrea Pozzi, who is a Bangor master student, and Andrea is big on his vipers. And this study is about our very own venomous species of snake, the adder. This was a conservation genetics study, so the goal was to try and find out the genetic health of a bunch of populations of UK adders. And long story short, it kind of suggested that adders in the UK are of quite low genetic variability, even though it might have appeared higher previously. And they have the genetic signature of snakes, which have undergone a massive population reduction and kind of breaking down into smaller populations, which is consistent with what's kind of happened to adders. You know, they would have been pretty much UK-wide, and now we've got humans in the way.
Small walls blocking them.
Exactly, yeah, savage. But, you know, there's some optimism surrounding their future, particularly with genetic rescue. That's something which is kind of mentioned in the paper, moving animals around to broaden the gene pools. And that's actually been in the news separately recently. But, you know, we'll discuss all that once it's been peer reviewed. But yeah.
You don't want to keep them isolated and promote fresh adder speciation.
Well,
they can all become
it's a balance, isn't it?
Super powered, super specific to their microclimate and never be forced out.
It's a real balance, and it honestly depends who you speak to, what people think about that. Some people are all just like, mix it all up. Yeah, genetic variability is the one. And other people are kind of like, well, as you say, we don't know.
Outbreeding depression, yeah.
Yeah, if you might accidentally introduce some genetic components which do more harm than good. But anyway, massive effort from Andrea. So yeah, congrats to him to have it at this stage, and we will talk about it in more detail once it comes out.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Cool. Good stuff. All right. Well, I think that's just about it, actually. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can, herphighlights@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the podcast via the Patreon, patreon.com/herphighlights. Thank you to all of those that do. We're on social media. Can't remember if I said that. But yeah, I think all that remains to be said is thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.